Today we are going to discuss the possibilities and the impossibilities of measuring environmental sustainability / impact metrics on natural capital investments, nature-based solutions, things like that. For my part, I've been working as a natural capital investor at a large institutional investment firm quite a while. But with all my experience in that, I decided that I strike out on my own and try and help the sell side, project managers, fund managers, etc., talking to the institutional investor, right? So what is it they want to hear? How do they want to hear it? How can you better sell your product to an institutional investor, speaking their language? So, without further ado, we have a panel here with very diverse expertise, so I would expect that we get a really lively discussion. And I would like to ask the esteemed panelists briefly to introduce themselves and tell us what the connection is with environmental metrics in their work. So, Tim, you start.
Thank you. So, Tim Field, I'm from the Cotswolds, and I look after a group of 100 farms in the Cotswolds that are looking at all of this and capitalising on their natural capital. That's part of my job. The other part of my job is working with the Rothamsted Research Institute, who are one of the oldest agricultural research institutes in the world, to commercialise their carbon measurement and modelling products and research. So I wear two hats on the panel today: farmer and carbon.
Thank you, Alexandra. We know you already.
You've heard me already, but my name is Alexandra Holmlund. My background is in forestry and forestry investments. And I'm here because I'm interested in developing what I would call a modern forest investment that consists of both wood flows, carbon flows, and biodiversity. And how to measure those three is something very important when you talk to investors. Yeah.
Anna.
Great, thank you for having me, Jos. So I'm Nanne Tolsma, the Head of Client Relations for Satelligence. And Satelligence, we are a service provider using satellite data to look at environmental risks.
Hi, I'm Kate Bullen. I was up here yesterday, and for folks that might not have heard, I'm Director of Sustainability and ESG at Forest Investment Associates, and we're a timberland investment manager currently operating in the US and Latin America, and with around $4 billion in assets under management, which metrics terms is more like 2 million acres of land, around 900,000 hectares. I guess why I'm up here and on metrics is I've been involved in public sustainability reporting on forestry investment for a long time. First public report in 2011, and a lot of evolution over time. So hopefully I can provide some perspective from how forestry investors have tried to keep up and also advance what impact investors, ESG-minded investors are looking for in terms of metrics and reporting, both what we can put publicly out there and disclose, but also how we use those to manage assets as well.
Rolf.
My name is Rolf Schmitz. I'm a co-founder of Collective Crunch. We're a Finnish-German company. We make heavy use of satellite originating remote sensing data, but we do think of ourselves much more as data analysts and data processors. We've built a fairly scalable solution that is currently focused on the Nordics and Baltics, covering 18 million hectares of forest land, with quite granular and superior accuracy to conventional solutions. And in the last half year, we have reached out to Latin America, to the US to some degree, and to take the solution there. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Let's go to the first question here. And I'd like you to imagine that you are a stakeholder in a land-based investment. You might be the owner, you might be an investor, and a land-based investment can be anything from agriculture, forestry, it can be a mangrove project, it can be all these things. Which couple of KPIs, key performance indicators of a healthy, profitable and durable investment are the most important in your view? So we're looking at for instance, soil health, water, things like that, biodiversity. So which ones are in your context the most important KPIs? Who wants to go first? Tim?
I'll go first. Obviously, I'm going to say soil carbon because that is something. But representing those 100 farms, we're looking at a landscape recovery project. Anyone familiar with DEFRA's new policy, they'll understand landscape recovery is working together as a group of farms to restore the landscape. And we're targeting rivers. So nitrate loading in the river or aquatic biodiversity or even flow rates and drought resilience. We'd be looking at something water-related for the context of where we're at, but always looking at soil carbon as well, because that is a proxy for so many other things, soil health and water resilience and nutrient of food and everything else. So yeah. I'd pull a water-related one and the carbon.
Yeah, it is all interrelated, right? So yeah, that's the always difficult answer. Alexandra?
Yeah, well, I thought I'll be rather traditional now. Well, looking at a forestry investment, obviously you want to know that you will be having secure cash flows from the forestry investment you have. So the first cash flow we look at is obviously coming from wood. So you want to be sure that the trees that you're planting can be sold, what the growth rate is, and what the cost of production of those cubic meters you're eventually going to sell is. And then to that, you would want to add carbon income. And even a carbon income has a cost to it, so you have to know how you are going to produce that carbon. And the third cash flow, hopefully coming soon, will be the biodiversity credit. But there we don't know much about neither the cost or the income. So
yeah. I mean, the income streams are very important, of course. The whole value of the thing, as a landowner, you want to have fertile land, thinking about agriculture, right? So and all the ecosystem services that land can provide to work to provide you with that value. So water, carbon, biodiversity, all these things that work. So Mary-Kate. So how do you, in terms of forestry, look at this, right? I mean, there are quite a few, like FSC and SFI, standards, I should say, certification standards. And so what is for you is important in terms of metrics or in terms of standards, and how do they live together?
Good question. And you have set up for me going to be the most interesting KPIs, which is very different from the most important. So I'll go somewhere in between the two, I think.
Okay.
I think in addition to the kind of core investment parameters that Alexandra's outlined that you'd want for any forestry investment, I think if you're trying to look after it from an ESG perspective, you mentioned certification, Joost, that's obviously really critical. I would say you might want to have kind of policy and procedure-based safeguards, which I wouldn't say are necessarily a KPI, but you could put it as a metric that you want to make sure the investment that you have or your manager has the right policies and procedures in place to avoid certain harm, or that you know if an incident arises, it's going to be captured and looked at and reported to you in the right way. Kind of going beyond those, tied to certification, thing I think more people should be looking at and asking for, and the one metric we put into our monthly, it's going to be quarterly, into our monthly ESG committee meetings, but on a quarterly basis, is a tracking of corrective action reports by type and severity. So that's telling us from a systems basis how we're performing and how frequently something goes wrong. And every investment has little things to big things go wrong. And a strong indicator of good performance from a manager level is going to be having visibility of how investments are being managed. And so that could be something as simple as we had a spraying for herbicides, and when we tested the waterway nearby afterwards, the threshold for chemical in the water was beyond the acceptable limit. That should be reported, and it will come through as a water car for us. That might be different than a roading car, which, you know, if we've got erosion coming off of a roadway, it tells us we need to be doing better at keeping up our roads so that we're not then getting into waterways from poor road management or having soil erosion. So seeing what are the types of cars, how they're managed, and how frequently they're coming through, what we're hoping to do and why we put that into our ESG committee meetings is because we want to identify trends, and we also want to be able to look a layer down at the property managers that we're using and see if they have any trends in the type of cars we're going and say, this manager's doing great on commercializing the wood, but really we need to get them on top of the roading situation, for example.
Yeah, yeah. But those are risk-based metrics, right? And you name erosion. Is erosion a particular KPI that you want to control? Is that one of the important things you want to control?
I think it tends to be an indicator of good forestry. It sounds kind of boring,
Yeah,
but when you
yeah,
have
yeah,
good
of
roading
course, yeah,
management,
yeah.
it's a sign that you're really managing the whole investment and the whole asset. And depending where that erosion's happening, it could be bad. And depending what state or country you're in, you could get a big fine for it. So foresters will complain a little bit that the state gets away with much worse roads than we get away with. So you might be on a worse road to get to your asset than you are once you're in it. But I think it's a useful indicator in that sense. Obviously, erosion for things like steeper slopes becomes much more important, where we want to make sure that you've got stability in the landscape. And so we watch erosion in those cases carefully, especially where, you know, if you get into mountainous kind of windy forestry roads in something like the Pacific Northwest, you can have a big erosion problem if you've got a road coming around a corner and it's on top of a slope. You can get a problem.
Yeah,
a safety problem.
absolutely. Now let's go to the remote sensing guys here. For instance, Nana, you look at whole value chains, etc. So what are your clients looking for in metrics, in wanting to measure something? And we go then to Rolf to maybe add something to that.
Yeah, no, indeed, I will have a look at it from a supply chain perspective. And I think in most cases, what we see is that as a company active in such a supply chain, you want to have KPIs that apply for the whole value chain, so that you can compare different units within your supply chain. One of the things that we, for instance, see, and also in relation to finance more and more, is a metric called verified deforestation free. So these are metrics to really look at a supply chain blue unit level for a company, like how are we scoring? And we see this already being used. We work with a couple of traders that actually use this as part of their loans. So they get more favorable interest rates if they reach specific agreements or thresholds that they have in place for this metric.
Okay. Rolf, any other?
So we're a technology company and we make heavy use of data. So what we do is geared towards what's scalable and what's sort of been approved or agreed upon. And so it's largely tree species, tree dimensions that we provide. We can provide classifications of tree dimensions and so forth. And of course, that solves the sort of commercial forest management to a large degree and the carbon side. But then, of course, the elephant in the room is the biodiversity. And from our perspective, we've had discussions with customers around this, and there is quite a bit of interest to basically say, are there species that reflect degrees of carbon, of biodiversity and so forth, to use proxies that you can scale, and then effectively you take the routine work of tracking those manually off the table, so that the manual work can focus on the things that you can't scale at that point in time, or where the processes haven't been agreed upon. So that's pretty much the state of play for us at the moment.
Okay, and so by measuring specific trees, you can say something about biodiversity. Are you then saying something about the tree biodiversity, or are you inferring other biodiversity given that this is a specific tree that attracts this, that, and the other?
So it's basically a scientific correlation between the presence of a tree correlating with the presence of biodiversity parameters, be
Yes.
it,
Okay, but that can be insects or
Right,
fungus
right.
or whatever. Yeah. Oh, all right. That's quite interesting. We discussed KPIs a bit now here, and my first sort of list of things that you might want to know in natural capital is, okay, what's the water use? What's the water quality? Are there any effluents? What's the health of the soil? Carbon emission sequestration, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and input efficiency, right? Are you not maybe using too much nitrogen or herbicides and all these things? So looking at what you now think is important, are there any metrics out there that give you a very good view on what's going on in any of these KPIs, right? So what should we measure if we care about a certain KPI? Can we do that already or not? Who will start? Nanne.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's more a question of it's easy to make a KPI of a metric, but can you make it comparable across geographies, projects, and these type of things? You can look at deforestation in number in hectares, but does it mean anything for you as an investor? And can you compare what you measure also to your other projects? Like you might have less deforestation in the Netherlands or whatever, but it might actually, since there is not much forest left, it might actually have a lot of impact compared to when you have much higher deforestation numbers in other countries. So I think that's sometimes a bit the issue when we try to fit it too much in specific metrics or KPIs, that it does not reflect the reality on the ground.
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? We're comparing the Netherlands with the Amazons, for instance. Huh?
Yeah.
But how do you solve that? How do you, is that there's not a metric to solve it, right? There's probably just some qualitative notes.
Exactly. Yeah. No. So that's what you would need to do. So to also, you can call it a skill or however you need to put that into the metric. But again, that complicates it then, right? It makes it more complicated to analyze when you start adding these dimensions to the space.
I honestly think we need to get comfortable with the fact that like comparability and standardization is a goal and an objective and a thing we should be seeking for. And those of you that are great with data and science and technology can help us keep getting there. But in the meanwhile, I think we really have to have a lot of engagement between investors, intermediaries, managers, companies, whatever the case is going to be. It works public or private investments. We are asking the entity you're invested with or in, what are you measuring and why, and what do you do with it? As an example, I got pushed back a year or two ago, like, why aren't you folks using this STAR metric, this species threat and assessment risk or something? I was like, well, what do you want to do with it? Because if I don't want to pick on any sector, but like if I'm a big bad mining company and I go to an area with really high, incredible biodiversity and a lot of at-risk species, you might be pretty concerned. But if I'm a super responsible forestry investor, you might say, please go to that area and do forestry well, because that's a forestry concession. And we don't want some, Wild West cowboys kind of extractive one-way loop going on, not a one-way loop. This process that's just take with no regeneration, no give back. So those metrics, I think, have a little bit of a risk. So just looking for a pure thing can be tricky. And we saw this with deforestation, kind of in the rising awareness from like maybe 2006 to 2015, where for better or for worse, we did a really good job in responsible investment of educating investors to the risks of deforestation and what that meant. But what that meant for me, working in responsible investment in forestry, was you'd say forestry, and people would be like, whoa, hands off. Like, we don't want to touch that because you cut down trees. And you'd have to really talk about and say, look, deforestation risk in your public equities is a problem. How about we look at your private markets investments and look for models where companies are able to establish responsible plantations, to restore landscapes, to protect biodiversity while doing the good, while producing goods. So I get a little worried with single metrics. It's how's it going to be used?
Single true. So So talking about single metrics, what do your clients ask of you then?
Oh.
What metric do they want to hear then?
I think you know of some large investors who ask a lot of things. I would ask, what of those things do you use? There's a lot of information requests that we get, and most of it tends to be qualitative rather than quantitative. The more consistent quantitative things coming through are around safety, injury rates, and incidents, which is really important to know, but can be very challenging, especially country to country, based on different kind of legal frameworks for how safety risk sits in companies. We are, basic stuff. How much area do you manage? How much of it is certified? How much timber did you produce? How much of that was certified? Those are really the core things. We're getting others that ask things like, what's the area of streams in your investment? Sure, I can tell you, but why do you want to know? And does that make one investment any better than the other? Again, I'd be more concerned with what's your compliance rate on water testing after risky treatments in your activities. Nobody asks that. Nobody.
Yeah. No.
Stream
Indeed.
miles and kilometers. People want to know.
So the number of hectares certified is the main metric currently, which is which is very high level, of course.
So we talked about this. Your manager needs to have a lot more metrics that they use to report on assets and to manage those assets. Like, we want to measure to manage, right? Not measure to report. So we need more than we give you. And you're going to ask for more than you can use. And so I've dealt with you in the past, Joost, when you were in a large investment entity. And I think we told you we have 80 ESG metrics plus financial and operational metrics. And we met with the team, and they're like, great. So we scanned the SDGs. And for SDG 15, life on land, we want to know how many hectares you have certified. So we went from like 120 total metrics to 80 ESG metrics to 1, because when you roll it up to a universal owner, you can't tolerate even a dozen metrics.
Yeah, no. That's very true. That's very true. It's one of the problems, of course, right? The receptiveness of the investor, of everybody,
Time is finite.
complicated, scientifically correct data, right? Yeah, that's a bit of a thing indeed. But we live and learn. Are there any questions from the audience on where we are going with respect to what are the KPIs to look for and how to measure them at this moment? The thing is coming.
Who pays for all this? That's what I'd like to understand. So I'm a developer, right? And you're a carbon buyer. And then all these matrix and everything else that you all want. But whose bill? Who pays for it? Is it the developer expected to fund all of the research and provide all this data information? Or does the buyer want to pay for that stuff?
Yeah, it's probably, well, I'll let some of them answer too, but in the space of investing in forestry, etc., you pay a fee to the foresting company, the investment manager, and they then, for that fee, amongst others, provide you with these metrics, right? So that's how that works. But
there is an interesting aspect in this, and I think you're right in asking the question the way you asked it. There's a lot of cost overload in doing all these things. That's massive, and that's something that, at the moment it is where it is, and what we try to bring to that is basically the efficiencies of using technology to its best capabilities to reduce that cost, because it's so high that a lot of people in this field basically say there are loads of projects that never get off the ground because the overhead of preparing it, the reporting and so forth is so excessive. The other thing is that there's a lot of growth coming there, and there's just not enough manual labor in terms of forest experts and so forth around to track all these things. So I think there has to really be a game change towards a completely different mindset of driving these things to be a lot more efficient and to focus on metrics that really are useful, that are targeted, and that hopefully are reasonably easy to manage. And sort of particularly in carbon projects, the key thing is the wood mass, which equates to carbon. And even if you have that and you agreed on it, then you need to track if the forest is still there. And even that in itself, if you just have that one metrics, that also is a challenge in terms of what rhythm do you do that on and so forth. So I think we really, from my perspective, I was really happy about these 2 days of conference because there's now a lot more thinking about scaling. There's a lot more sort of something has to change here where, in my view, 3 years ago, I spent years speaking to people about technology use in this. And there was so much skepticism that we actually went to the commercial forest market because we couldn't get it off the ground. And now, to my mind, there's a lot more sort of optimism around let's scale this. And I think this cost aspect that you bring up is key. To my mind, it doesn't even matter who pays for it. It's a cost of the product, of the project, and effectively it has to be covered.
I would say in the traditional kind of forestry and ag space where your investment is for a good rather than for carbon or biodiversity as ecosystem services, the vast majority of existing ESG data comes from resource management data that people already have and use to manage their investments. Yeah. Comes from spatial mapping that we already do. It's just looking at things a little differently and then sometimes asking for a bit more of that kind of like incident or process-based reporting. But reporting on a process doesn't take the effort. Having the process takes the effort. So that's kind of done. The other thing I would say is that ESG manager secret here, you can get a lot in under the banner of risk because it's your fiduciary duty to manage risk. So if a metric or information helps you understand and manage risk, you're good. You can get that in. So I spent, 8-9 years being like, this is a risk. How do we do more on this? Let's do that. Where we're going now is how do we layer on the good on top of that? And so to spend, $200,000 to work with a developer to get remote sensing that's going to give us better information about streamside management zones where we don't commercially harvest, that's unlikely to happen until we see a benefit for doing that. And an investor says, I want to understand more about the streamside management zones because I have a commitment to 30% of nature protected by 2030. Then we would start to do it. So that's a little bit of a different thing. And I think where the automation and scaling is very helpful, we are in a bit of a pickle where I think timberland managers are not in the position to work with the folks developing the technology. It's just like it's a chicken and an egg situation. Like we'd love to use it when it's ready. You're going, we'd love to give you something you'll use, but we can't spend the time to work together in a way. So maybe venture tech just has to keep.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I'm going to slightly echo that in the agricultural setting, that carbon, biodiversity, water quality and so on should be byproducts of good practice. You should be incentivized to do the right thing in your farming system and then be rewarded not just from a good quality product, but also from these natural capital markets. And that comes from managing your resources wisely, your diesel use, your nitrogen use, your cultivation techniques, your crop rotations, and managing that data where it's where you can then just plug it into the multiple platforms there are now to calculate your carbon emissions or sequestration rates. Obviously, that all needs verification, and that comes at a cost. But there are carbon traders out there at the moment that will do your monitoring, your baselining for free at the moment, just to get access to the commission that they'll get from your carbon trade in agriculture.
What I do in my business is to aggregate. I come from Sri Lanka. You cannot get anything more than 17 acres. If you're a private individual, if you're a company, you have 50 acres. That's the land law. So there's no possibility on earth of doing anything in Sri Lanka unless you aggregate. So when you aggregate, what you have to do is I have a partnership with every single tea estate, every single Buddhist temple, whatever. So I aggregate, right? So now I have a whole pile of stuff. So by aggregating, I have now got the scale you require. But then we sit there thinking, okay, so I earn $100 from my carbon. Just say, for example, it doesn't make sense to me that I then have to spend $98 of it on all that you guys want. And then I have no money to share with my partners because then it doesn't incentivize anybody to work. So what I would like to put out there is to say, thinking about this, it's all very, first of all, I work with Nana and I really like what he does. And by the way, I'm here because of him. And I like his business because they have a more cost-effective model than a lot of other people I've talked to. But the reality is this. Every penny I spend on doing this administrative reporting stuff is a penny I cannot plow back into the local communities, to the local environment, to the people of the country who ultimately are the owners. I don't own land. I simply acquire the carbon rights. So for me, what I want is a capitalist structure where all of this wonderful stuff you do doesn't just go back to the West. You need to put money back into the global South. And that has to be equitable. And that I echo what Sandeep had to say yesterday. It is fair and just that you give the money back to the people who own the credit, the carbon in the first place. So please, when you ask for all these matrix that you have, come up with a budget for it. So we're very happy to do whatever you want, but you need to give us extra money to do it. That's all I request.
Of course.
I think it's important to point out that things like forest certification and carbon standards, and hopefully biodiversity standards will go this way, do have different levels of expectation for smaller projects and for smallholders. So, for example, the ACR registry in the US has a different methodology that allows a lighter touch remote sensing for smallholder carbon projects than is required of a larger landowner. So we're trying to address some of these barriers and scale issues in different ways, and I think biodiversity should follow that trend.
And I'll just say, we're not operating in the Global South at the moment, but in the UK, where there's an expectation now to be measuring your soil carbon for the forthcoming government subsidies, there's the opportunity for getting your ducks in a row with your data management, in-field soil sampling, so that you can apply for that subsidy from the government, whilst also that doesn't actually preclude you from the carbon market. So that concept of blended finance of the government and the private finance is sort of falling into place with the forthcoming DEFRA ELMS strategies. But I couldn't answer to your Global South challenge, which I agree with you. Yep.
But I think the mechanism is a different one. Yesterday there was the term wall of money, and I think you were actually involved in that. There's a lot of money in the Western world wanting to invest, but there is a reputational risk if you invest in something and then it basically goes up in smoke, literally, or is being damaged, or it's not being reported on. And there is a reputational risk there. And I think that drives a lot of the interest or necessity for metrics, because otherwise you will not release that money to be invested. I don't think there's a way around that part.
No, I agree. I think metrics are very important and they have to be relevant for what you're doing. Otherwise, you have a problem, will not attract the capital. I just want to echo about what you've been saying there about smallholders. I come from a totally different perspective. Where I work in Sweden, we have all sorts of data. And we have forest owners associations that are today thinking about how to incorporate biodiversity into making it a product, basically. But here we are very lucky because there already exist a lot of both the IT systems that they can use collectively and also very granular data that we can build on to create a credit together with them.
Yes, there was a question up here. I don't know if we wanted to read it quickly.
It's gone now, I see.
Oh,
There it is.
Yeah, is there a forum? Sorry, you can read it.
Well, you read it. Sure,
Moderator now.
No, it's just I met someone at lunch and I want to share about their organization. So is there a forum at international level which will facilitate private agroforestry projects to move forward and assist them in their venture? I was struggling. I was like, no, there's no international forum, but there is Restoration Seed Facility. Is someone in the room to raise your capital? So that might be an example of a group that's working with a variety of private sector funders. If you want the mic, maybe you could answer that question. I don't know. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Or maybe you can repeat it.
Yeah, Restoration Seed Capital Facility. Yes. So there are, and I would look up forest landscape restoration as a concept and look up seed funding. There are things that exist out there where the barrier of this upfront project work and evidence is lower, and trying to address it. Kind of not the buckets that most of us play in, to be honest, but there are folks doing that.
All right. There's another one, and this is about shared supply chains. So, Anne, Rolf, take it away.
I will pick it up, yeah. It's behind the flower. Let's see. So the question is, what are your thoughts on attribution of impact investment in shared supply chains? So yeah, I think that's also what we see when we look at measuring and monitoring these type of things in a shared supply chain, is that no one wants to take the responsibility or pay for it, of course. So what in generally happens is that when you look at the whole supply chain, you have a retail organization. They will ask to the consumer good company to provide metrics, and the consumer good company will ask the trader. And that way it goes. That way it goes upstream in the supply chain. But I think what you see more and more happening, at least what we see, is that companies start working more together in the vertical of the supply chain, and that also means investing more together collectively, rather than just pushing the responsibility to someone else.
Yeah, but is that then that the end user, let's say the supermarket, takes the brunt of the share of that, or is it equally distributed along this?
Yeah, well, yeah. So right now, I think they almost take no share, the retail. So it's the responsibility and also the investing so far is mainly close to the production. So the traders and the companies that buy from cooperatives that usually have to provide this type of information to consumer good companies. Otherwise, they simply cannot sell their product. So it's happening there, but now there is more redistribution of investment. So also retail and consumer goods companies that basically start investing in this well together.
Okay, all right. But maybe one last word from me on your comments. Or what we are discussing here is, from my perspective, I look at it as a institutional investor who has a fiduciary responsibility to look after its investments. And how can I be sure that the people who are working on my investment are doing the right thing, are keeping my investment alive, keeping the soil healthy, the waterways, all these things. So yeah, that costs a lot of money. Maybe if you are there as another type of investor, maybe as a carbon investor, all these different types of metrics are not fully necessary, right? So and hopefully with remote sensing and stuff on deforestation and carbon, etc., prices will go down, won't they, Nanne?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, they will. They are. Yeah, they are going down. No, of course. Yeah.
All right. So we discussed the KPIs, right? And now into metrics. What do you want to measure? We discussed water, soil health, biodiversity, and things. So are there any metrics that stand out, that say, okay, if we use this, then we got it covered for this KPI? Or is the situation not quite as like that? Who wants to take it? Tim?
I'll kick off. I might reference the Sustainable Food Trusts. What do I call it? Global. Oh my goodness, it's gone out of my head now. I think you wrote it down. Global.
Yeah.
Worked on it for 5 years. I can't remember its name.
It just changed its name. I wrote it down.
But they looked at creating a balanced scorecard of all metrics, and they looked at the 300
Sustainable Food Trust. Yeah.
Sustainable Food Trust, Global Farm Metric.
Global Farm Metric.
Yeah. And it's what Patrick Holden and the team there and a bunch of us landowners wanted to do was to try and start comparing apples with apples, not just in carbon, but in carbon, water, animal health, plant health, biodiversity, human, social equity, and everything from health and safety, profitability to all of those, the whole scorecard of metrics. And there are, I think, something like 367 different models out there that you can run that for agriculture. And we distilled it down to 4, and then distilled that down and ran those on 5 farms, and then distilled it down to 1. I've been refining that for the last 5 years. And I think the important thing is that we do always consider that balanced scorecard. And then when we look at what is in it for the farmer, what is in it for the producer, not just the person selling the carbon or the biodiversity, but the whole, we're looking at the whole picture, not just down the carbon lens or the biodiversity lens or And then, as I said at the start, you look at your local context. We're going in for a big river restoration project in the Cotswolds, so we're looking more specifically at water quality. We'll be looking at the invertebrates in that watercourse through citizen science. We'll be using potentially nature metrics, which is the DNA testing in the water. We will be looking at all sorts of different things water related, but we won't be forgetting the other elements of that scorecard. So the public access and the animal welfare. And then, of course, carbon as well. Soil carbon is, as I said at the beginning, a proxy for soil health, water retention, and everything else. So I always think there should be a soil carbon element in there as well.
Which is not easy to measure, but doable, I guess, I hope. So looking at what Tim just said, right? So what could you, the other panelist, provide to him in terms of technologies, in terms of metrics to achieve all this? Let's not look at costs for now. We can later eliminate all the costly ones, but what could you do, Alexandra?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about being a forester. We're very good at measuring trees. And we usually have permanent plots that we re-measure every 10 years. We have a very clear time frame when we go in and when we measure those trees, and we follow up on the growth and everything that we want to see. And I think what we can learn from forestry is exactly that, to have a standardized measurement regime and permanent plots. Permanent plots are, I think, a very good idea when you look at a lot of different things. You always go to the same place and you have a number of years or months or whatever. Agriculture is a bit faster than forestry. And you just go back to the same place and see what has happened. You can measure the change.
Nanne, some new tech.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a good question, but I think that what the issue then mainly is on this point is that when you ask usually a remote sensing company like what can you provide us, or when you describe what you're looking for, you say, oh, with satellites you can do everything, right? That's what you should answer then. But that's not the case. Usually it's a combination of things, and I think that's what we should be looking more for, like in partnerships with either organizations that are active on the ground and that do specific types of measurements, to find that right combination of what works best to measure specific things, because you cannot do it all with one technology or one approach. It's just like remote sensing, it's just a piece of the puzzle, and you need to work together with other companies to come to the right metric. Or
Absolutely. All of you mentioned something about calibration.
Yeah, we look at this, and that's why I said in the beginning, we're much more in analytics than a remote sensing company in the way we see ourselves. We've put about half our investment in the product and the solution in data engineering, which is effectively getting data into the solution, and the other half is in modeling. So what Alexandra and others described in terms of whatever the number of years measures there are, we can take all of that into the solution and model that on a very large scale. So we have harvester data like in the Nordics, several million hectares. We can take sampling data of Excel sheets, whatever it is, and put into models, and to basically, with this kind of ground truth, calibrate models for useful results. And maybe on the sort of holy grail of finding a few metrics, I'm not sure that's realistic, because there's very, very different forest regions, climates. There is very different objectives that you can have in this. There's small projects, there's large projects. I think it's a little bit over-optimistic to say, and here's sort of the three that we're going to use. But what we can bring to this is really everything on accuracy of forest inventory, species, dimensions, and so forth, measured over time. You get it timely if there's been a storm and so forth. And then we are increasingly then taking that to go more into proxies for biodiversity. And that's the stuff that we do. And internally, from a product development perspective, it's about where's the value, what people really need. It shouldn't be the technology coming up with, here's a set of parameters that we could model, and if they're not useful, we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, hence the most important question was, what are your KPIs? How do you measure success? Right? What is that? Is that improve biodiversity? Is that carbon sequestration?
Can I put out a request for an analytics solution? I just
borrow your pen?
Yeah. So I'm just thinking through like a couple of things. So one of our challenges is really biodiversity, and particularly like fauna biodiversity and what's out there and how valuable is that, et cetera, but also flora. So yesterday there was a comment made in an example forestry investments in Australia. There's 40,000 koalas. I was there at the time we figured that out, and we had to hire a lady who, over a series of months, went to every plantation and walked in lines, going very slowly, looks for koalas, counts them, and then there's really fun statistics you do about, well, I saw this koala and it was 7 meters to the right of the line, and this one was 1 meter to the left here, so this tells me the population density of koalas is X. That's really resource intensive, and it took a good chunk of money for her to do that.
Yeah.
Another thing that was happening with koalas is we wanted to know where they were before harvesting took place, because that's very important, because koalas are a little bit dopey and a little bit doped. So you need to know if there's a koala in the tree. So one thing that was tried was flying drones with, Sarah, what's the sensing technology? Heat sensing, thank you for the word. Heat sensing technology that would go, oh, hot spot in a tree canopy, most likely a koala. And so you could know where they were. And you had to do that in the early morning when you had the heat differential so that you got their body temperature picked up. And then a person would go out and manually rope off, basically flag off the area where that koala is in a cluster of trees. So it had somewhere to go. The harvester doesn't go there. It leaves it alone. Also pretty manual. The UAV really improved things, because before that, we had koala sniffing dogs. They don't sniff the koala, they sniff koala poop at the bottom of the trees, and they find the poop, and then they go, oh, and they look up the tree, and the person goes, yes, confirmed koala. All very manual. And this is to say, and this is new forest work, so I want to give them credit on that, and other industry players in Australia. It costs about $1 a ton of timber to protect koalas in that area of the country. It takes a lot of money. So I was thinking about that, and I was like, what would help us? So what if we can fly drones that are using cameras that are using these apps that are going, that's a this plant, that's a this bird, that are doing automated biodiversity surveys of areas that are beyond our cost right now. We don't map biodiversity in SMZs, and that's where the biodiversity is, but we don't do it because it doesn't contribute to the cash flows, it doesn't come through to the book value, there's no reason, so no one would pay for it. But if you make that cheap enough and fast enough and easy enough or automated, then it's something that we would super happily do. And you might get us to then start doing things like, well, this area is lower biodiversity. Do you want to raise it? What could we do? So I think that type of thing would be really fun. And right now the industry absorbs $1 per ton for koala protection because nobody wants koalas to get hurt while we're harvesting eucalyptus trees, and that's a reputation risk. So again, that's all under the banner of risk. It's not really because we want to be good to the koalas. You have to have your forest certification. But everyone, even if they don't care about certification, is doing it because they don't want to get pulled over the coals by the public. So
yeah. Well, obviously the first thing you need to do is manage risks, right? But the second and very important thing is see the value for all these ecosystem services, like koalas provide ecosystem services. I'm pretty sure how that goes into the value of everything, and that is a thing that is only now developing, I guess, and what you are trying to do, and with tokenization, etc., that might be a next step. So we have not many more minutes. Let's take this question. Today, a typical time frame to complete a single forest investment is about 1.5 years. And a lot of money destined for forests go to transaction costs, middlemen, etc. How can we reduce both this time frame and the cost? I have an answer, but it's probably not what you're looking for. But I would say if a forest company wants to sell a forest investment to an institutional investor, they should hire my services. I can tell them how to shorten that time frame tremendously. But that's not what they're looking for, I guess. So
that's a long time frame. So I'm guessing this is someone who's not in a deep liquid timberland market and is looking maybe more in emerging markets where there's less information. So I think just for reference, I've heard of everything as low as 2.5 weeks to a bid date through to deals that probably took 4 years from first conversations. And the difference there is when you have a prepared seller, that gives you all the information as done it. So that is transaction cost on the seller side to present, put their best foot forward to the market and get the best price back. And that's where we just do confirmatory due diligence, tick the box, everything's excellent. But when you're getting into some of these really complicated emerging markets, and you might just be looking at a concession where you want to develop a forestry project, and there's very little information, that does take a super long time. What I would say to shorten it, apart from magic automation and drones doing the work, which drones can now map stuff better, is to focus on threshold risks and problems and what would make the investment a no-go for you. As long as you know what your no-goes are and what you can't go beyond, if you're confident you can manage other things, you can get through that investment process quickly. So you might not have a full environmental and social impact assessment before you invest, but you will know, do I have enough area that is plantable based on appropriateness of site condition and biodiversity aspects, those types of things? Is there a land tenure claim over it? Because you can't undo land tenure claims, those types of things. So focus on the stuff that you can't manage beyond in that to shorten the time frame.
Okay, thank you. 5 minutes. So as a closure, I would like to ask the panelists what in the latest developments, and they find most encouraging, developments that can lead to better metrics, better reporting, things like that, so that we know more about the ecosystem services in the investments that we make. So there are things like new regulation influencing investments like the EU taxonomy, SFRD, CSRD. There is the whole improvements in the remote sensing world and data science. There is, the sustainability discussion expanding beyond carbon, right? We're looking at biodiversity in a serious way. I think that also the mindset of investors is to go from risk management to value. It's nascent, but the development is there. And other initiatives like the TCFD, TNFD, Business for Biodiversity, things like that. There's a lot of things happening. And I'd like your take on it. What do you think is most promising, or maybe there's nothing, but Tim, you start.
Well, it's. I mean, just the technology I'm working with at the moment with Carbon Question and this. A year ago, we were sampling fields with a big heavy backpack and a handheld sensor that you push against the sod and you get a reflection. That is now the size of a sort of camcorder type thing. Just in a year, it's becoming incredibly efficient and effective, and we're constantly building that data to make that more streamlined. So on the one hand, that technology and how that then links to satellite verification and so on is exciting space. The other exciting thing is this bid that's been keeping me up all week for landscape recovery in the DEFRA field is that there is a genuine appetite to work this out. We've got a couple of banks on board with this landscape recovery bid, looking at innovative finance models and products. So, I was just thinking back to that 1.5-year time frame. I was like, I wish it was that short in agriculture. My God, it's hard to get this some of these products over the line in agriculture. But I'm very optimistic we're going to see some serious progress in the next 2 to 3 years, as certainly in the UK, as the government policy sort of nestles in and we get a bit more consensus around permanence, additionality, and so on, and of course the tech advances.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add something?
With the technology background, sure. Or did you want?
No, please go ahead.
I think the sensor comment is a good one. Sensors get better, smaller, cheaper. This is the trajectory. And micro constellations of satellites, that basically, get an update, a scan every day. Drones. There's some really exciting things going on. The thing that I wanted, sort of particularly for this kind of audience here, that I wanted to address, though, is for us the limiting factor isn't the sensors, isn't the technology, isn't our ability to do data science. The limiting factor is very often that companies take a lot of time to even think about a pilot. Now, a pilot is supposed to prove something. Why do I debate with several customers for 2 years to do a pilot. That's a contradiction almost in itself. So there's a lot of good stuff that technology can do. And what I would like you to think or to take away, at least from from myself for this, is do stuff and see if it works. And we're spending an enormous amount of time talking to people. I spent a Red Plus project just top of my mind last year. We were talking for a year, and then I thought, I'll stop it here. It just doesn't work. We're discussing a pilot. They haven't even given us the data. And just, a pilot is something to see if it's useful. So, do this stuff, you learn something. That's sort of my mission here. I don't think it's a technology advance that will sort of save us all. It's a mentality to go out and do
Be
stuff.
bold. I absolutely agree. Be
That
bold.
is a big thing for me because I'm the business development guy.
From my perspective, then, from the investor perspective in Europe, what I think is very encouraging is the new regulations, right? The SFRD, all the reporting requirements. They need to be interested in your stuff now, because if they're not, they fall behind, right? So double materiality, that's a new thing. Everybody was talking about fiduciary duty and all these things, but currently it is not. What is the environmental risk on your company? That's one thing of the double materiality. The other thing is, what is the risk of your company on the environment? You need to report on that. So you need to measure. You need to know, and that is, I think, a very good, still young development, and I think that the rest of the world will follow and is following. But time's up. Thank you very much for your attention.